Do you like this picture? I mean, I like this picture. I think it looks good. This is just a foundation. We've got to do a retouch and get rid of that light and fix the background. But overall, I think the picture looks pretty good. There's a cool expression on her face. She's reaching out the camera, the dress, the way it's floating. It's fantasy, it's storytelling, it's impact. I think it's cool. But the question is this even a real picture? Well, I don't think it is. And you know how I know? Because I made it up. I brought in a different dress. I brought in a different face. That's the real picture. There's the cool face. There's the cool dress. And nobody would be the wiser. So you know what we're going to do in today's tutorial? Frankenstein. Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. This tutorial today is going to be a brief one where I'm going to take you through the entire process of what I would do to solve problems that we often encounter in our photography, where we like three different images. We like the dress in one, we like the face on another one, and we need to Frankenstein them together into one new picture and ask ourselves a very crucial question. Does it look real? Does it look good? Do you like the picture? Will the audience like the picture? So I'm going to take you through the best practices to do all of that and then have a little bit of a discussion at the end about how we are our worst critics and ultimately we are the ones that stand in our way of problem-solving images like this to put them together to create the final artwork. So with that, let's dive into the Photoshop and begin the journey of making a Frankenstein piece of artwork. So during this photography session, I was doing a demonstration at a vendor booth called Intuition Backgrounds, and this was at a photography conference called Shutterfest that I've taught at for 4 years. It's a wonderful event with 80 amazing instructors covering all genres of photography. It takes place in St. Louis, Missouri every year in the United States. So please check out Shutterfest. Also check out Intuition Backgrounds. This background is stunning, and I got to do some demonstrations in their vendor booth during the conference, and I fell in love with this background, and I can't wait to get my very own copy. So look to the description below both to see a link to Shutterfest as well as Intuition Backgrounds. Now, doing this demonstration and photographing this young lady, her name is Miranda Rain, and you can see more of her amazing artwork by also looking in the description below for her social media credentials. We got a chance to work together very briefly. I was photographing as well as teaching, so there was a bunch of folks standing around me asking questions as we worked. So ultimately, I didn't get to do what I typically do as an artist and take time on set to get the images right. I had to go quickly, and I was kind of torn between the teaching brain, the art brain, and trying to make everything work together. So this is my base image that I like the overall body and pose of this one, but I like the dress of this picture, and why? Well, first, the reason why is not so much the cool flow of it, it's because I'm looking at the other leading lines in this scene, which are very minimal, but ultimately we have some straight lines because of this background. The overall body alignment of Miranda is pretty straight and standing up. So having the dress in this one kind of have this diagonal and working against it in asymmetry, there's nothing wrong with that. That's totally fine. I just don't want that. I like the dress from here. It's not so much about the cool detail. I like that the dress would have a straight horizontal line, so to speak, against these verticals of her body in the background, and I think that just creates more of a cohesion of composition. So I want to borrow the dress from this image and put it into our base, but I also want to borrow her face from this one, because in both of these, she's blinking in this one, which is totally fine because we were going a mile a minute. And then I had directed her to look off to my right, look off camera right, but I didn't hold up my hand. And that's typically my practice when I tell models or subjects in front of the camera to look somewhere else besides the lens. I will hold up my hand and let that be a moving target so that they have something to look at. And that's a quick little tip in photography. Instead of telling models or subjects, look to your left, look off this way, look that way, move your hands and point to something that they can make contact with. It makes it so much easier for them. I didn't hold up my right hand because I'm right-handed and my right hand was on the camera. So I said, look to the right, and it's not her fault. She just looked a little bit further off camera than what I want. So I'm going to use this picture. Now, here's a big red flag. This picture is vastly different in composition than these pictures are. First, This picture, I am lower to the ground to the subject. I have lowered down onto a knee, shooting up at her. So compositionally, that's different. Her chin is up just a little bit more. She's a little bit more taller and standing statuesque, whereas in this one, I'm standing up and she's a little bit shorter than me. So the chin is down a little bit more and I'm a little bit closer to her in this frame. Typically, I would recommend, if you need to Frankenstein a face swap from one image to another, that you find a face that is roughly in the same composition as the base image that you're trying to fix, so to speak. But I didn't have one in this framing and composition where she's looking right at the lens. So I went ahead and looked at this one and thought, I think I can pull this off. And spoilers, I tested it before I started recording the tutorial and I totally can do it. So ultimately, I want to take her face from this one and push it into this scene. Now, you can get away with this in this type of compositional change because of a couple of factors. One, let's talk about the spectacle of the image. Ultimately, this is a fantasy piece. So folks are going to be a little forgiving in certain things because this isn't, let's say, a typical high school senior portrait photograph. And speaking to that, the clothing that she's wearing, the hairstyle, with an elaborate hairstyle, elaborate clothing, the audience is going to forgive certain things. They may not even see certain things because of the overall spectacle and impact. If she was wearing a t-shirt and some jeans and she had a ponytail and we could see her neckline, this totally would not fly. It would just feel off visually when the audience connects with it. But because of all of this, because the top part of her dress comes all the way up as a turtleneck, I think we can hide the visual disparagements that are going to happen when you have two different compositions. Even though the lighting pattern has not changed, the position of the lens and its orientation to the subject has vastly changed between this picture and that one. But because of spectacle and story and everything else that we see into all of this, I think we can get away with it. So let's start with the hardest part, which is to move this head into this image. And to get started with it, I need to make a selection of this head, and I'm going to do that by using the lasso tool. So I'm hitting L for the hotkey for the lasso tool, and I'm going to make a selection that comes down into her chest and make sure that I've got material below her head and above it to work with as I work with the layer mask and bring it into the scene. So I've got a decent selection here. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control Command letter D to deselect and do it again because I was missing just a little bit there because I wasn't looking as I completed the circle. Now that I have it, I'm going to go ahead and hit Control or Command and letter J for duplicate so I have its own layer here. Then I'm going to hit V for the move tool, hold shift and bring it up into the tab that says base. This is my base image that I want to work with. Because I'm holding shift, it's going to drop it precisely into the center. I only do that because if you don't hold shift, wherever your mouse is at is where it's going to drop the layer. So sometimes if your mouse is over here and you let go, your layer's there. If you've got a bunch of layers, it can be hard to find it. So just hold shift when you bring it in. It's a good practice to get into. But obviously, which one is different? There's something different about these. So let's start resizing this one to make it fit. And there's a couple of quick tips or tricks that you can do to help you along in that process. First, what I want to do is to make sure that your ruler is turned on. If it isn't, come up to view and then check rulers and have that be on so that we can make a guide. I'm going to click anywhere on the ruler. It doesn't matter where I click and hold and bring a ruler guide down, and I'm going to put it right at the top of her hairline in this scene. That's the first helper here, so to speak, to be able to size this new head and have it match. Now the next thing that I want to do is make a blank layer at the top of the layer stack itself, and I want to make another visual guide that helps me with the proportions of her head in this base image. So I'm going to use the elliptical marquee tool. I'm going to start drawing a marquee that is ultimately roughly about the size of her face. Now here's another quick tip. When you draw with the marquee, what I did is that origination starting point up here, I'm moving it down now, but I'm like, no, it's not encompassing her forehead. While you're drawing, just go ahead and holding down the mouse button while you're drawing, hold the space bar, and then you can move this around. It's not going to increase in size again. It lets you reposition it wherever you need it to be, and then let go of the space bar and you can continue to draw. So this way you can start getting kind of pseudo-accurate proportions of her head, and then position it until we fit and make sure that it looks good across the entire scene, and it looks pretty good right about there. So now I'm letting go, and with that selection active on my new blank layer, I'm going to fill it with the color white by hitting Alt or Option and the backspace key. So now I have a rough ovular shape that I know is proportionally pretty much the size of her head. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control Command and letter D for deselect. Now I'm going to lower the opacity of this just a little bit because I want to be able to see her original face in the base image. Now let's turn on the new picture. Hit V for the move tool. On the move tool, if you do not have this box checked that says show transform controls, check it. That way you will have these little bounding boxes around the perimeter so you can start resizing the layer. So I'm going to resize it by grabbing the corner here and holding Alt or Option. That will resize all of them at the same time. I'm going to move it over and try to position it so that her head and face roughly fit in that ovular shape. This is not a one and done. This is just a way to kind of help us as we have to start making decisions, fighting our own doubts, and fighting our own doubts will be the subject of my final thoughts at this tutorial. So, or for this tutorial, I should say. So ultimately, I think we're pretty close there. Let's go ahead and resize it here. I'm not holding Alt at this time, so it's resizing it from that orientation point in the upper right-hand corner. And getting it roughly to about there. I'm making sure the top of her head here comes right up to that guide that we made so that I know overall the size is good. Let's go ahead and bring this in just a little bit more, and I think that's pretty close. Now I'm going to hit Enter to accept the transformation, and let me explain why that's important. When you start resizing something and transforming it in Photoshop, you have to enter to accept the transformation, and something very important happens. If you take a big image or a big layer and you resize it to make it smaller, and then when you hit Enter to accept the transformation, all of that excess information is deleted by Photoshop and it's gone. It's one of its ways to keep your file sizes smaller. So that's fine if that's the only time you need to transform it. But let's say no, you're like, it's too small. I want to increase the size of it. Now Photoshop has to make up new information. It doesn't have access to all that excess information from the original transformation. It's got to make up something new. The more that you do that and hit Enter to accept the transformation, the more that the pixels go through a lot of changes, which ultimately can make that layer look fuzzy and out of focus. So be careful how much you do that. And we're going to do a quick little trick here at the end of this process to help us out with those problems, because we'll probably have to resize this a couple of more times. So now that we roughly know where it's at, I'm going to go ahead and turn off that little helper layer, and I'm going to clear my guide by coming up to View and down to Clear Guides. Now, I'm going to put a black mask onto this new head to hide it, and then bring it back by painting white onto the mask. To make the black mask, I'm going to come down to the mask icon in the layers window, hold Alt or Option and click it. Now I have my black mask. Now that new head is hidden, and then I'm going to start painting white on it to reveal that layer. I'm painting with a soft round brush at a flow of 100% and an opacity of 100%. Now, typically when I do face swaps, again, I'm borrowing a face from a roughly same proportional image and composition, I will start painting over the eye, and that's a fast way to make sure that everything aligned, but of course it doesn't, and poor Miranda just looks interesting. So let's continue painting, because the point here is not to make sure that it matches up from the facial structure, just the overall shape. And I'm going to paint just down a little bit. Let's zoom in a touch. I'm going to change the flow of my brush now to 10% so I can start feathering in this effect just a little bit around that perimeter. Then go back to 100 and bring in the hair and make sure that we get everything we need, including those little flyaways and so forth. That all looks good. If there's any little disparagements of the background where some of the background details out of focus compared to the rest, those are easy fixes with the clone stamp tool, frequency separation, all that kind of stuff. If you're not familiar with frequency separation, take a look at the card above. It will take you to the retouching series on this channel when you're done with this video. So ultimately, I think it looks good from the mask, but now we need to decide, does this proportionally look good to her body? No, it does not. Her head she looks like she's in the end of Beetlejuice when he gets the little stuff spring in his head. Yeah. So we need to increase the size of her head. So V for the move tool. And I'm going to increase it now just a little bit. Hit Enter to accept the transformation. Take a peek. I feel like it needs to be just a touch bigger. So let's go ahead and increase it on all sides. Hit Enter to accept the transformation. Take a look at it. That looks too big to me. So I'm going to hit Control or Command and the letter Z to go one step back in my history. I think that looks pretty good. I want to nudge it one more time, so I'm just going to increase the size of it just a little bit right there. Hit Enter to accept the transformation. Nudge it over just a touch. Proportionally, I think we're good. And again, final thoughts, we're going to talk about some of the icky feelings you may be feeling when you do something like this. But let's move on to the last part and grab this part of the dress. So same drill, L for the lasso tool. We're going to make a selection that covers a little bit of her waist and so forth in the dress, getting a little bit of that background into it. We just need the dress, but we need some of this excess material, potentially if there's some subtle variations of shadows or things along those lines. Now that we have that selection, Control or Command letter J to duplicate, V for the move tool, holding shift, bringing it into our base document, dropping it into the scene. Now we'll go ahead and go through the same process again and move this first to make sure it lines up. And I'm going to reduce the opacity of this just a little bit. And I'm looking at her waist right here to make sure that the two line up, because proportionally and compositionally, these are pretty much the same. All right, so that's lined up. I think that's good. Increase the opacity back to 100%. Put a black mask onto it to hide the entire thing. Paint with white at 100% flow and opacity and start bringing it into the scene. And I'm going to stay along the original lines of the dress and not expand out too much more because the backgrounds are roughly the same. I'm going to get pretty close up to the waistband, but I'm starting to see some of her fingers from her hand and pose of the image where we borrowed this scene. So we'll continue to address that here, but let's get a majority of the dress back into the scene and make sure it all looks good and paint that in. Now, we've done a lot of white painting, but it's hard to kind of see because we're trying to reveal a black dress on top of a black dress and it's visually difficult to see. So let's take a look at the layer mask itself to make sure that we aren't missing any data from this picture that we just brought in. And to look at the layer mask itself, while it's selected, just hold Alt or Option and click it. And anywhere in black in the inside of this is where data is missing. So now I can just paint some white into those areas to make sure that it all fits. And then to return to the normal view of the layer mask, just hold Alt and then click the mask again. Now let's zoom in and come up to those fingers and solve this problem very easily. I'm going to change the flow of my brush to 20%, switch back to black as my foreground color to start hiding that new layer and getting rid of those little fingers right through there. And then just kind of feather this down to make sure it follows the rough flow and contours of the dress and we don't have any major issues or telltale signs where something is missing. And I think that looks pretty good. Control Command of the number 0 to zoom all the way back out. And even now, taking a look at this, we were focused on the dress and all that kind of stuff, but now looking at her head, I think it looks fine. And what just happened there, where we're looking at the dress, is the final tip that I want to cover in the final thoughts. And we're almost there, but ultimately, we've Frankenstein this together and created an entirely new pose that fits the storytelling, the impact, the flow of the dress, the composition, and everything, and it works. And this is the image that I would want to work on in a full tutorial. And speaking of full tutorials, I have restarted my Patreon channel. I initially started Patreon long ago before I started the YouTube channel. Then I came to the YouTube for a few different reasons. I'm now restarting Patreon and I'm going to be pushing full tutorials and content both in photography and in Photoshop to Patreon. So if you'd like to join me and support me on Patreon and continue your education in photography and Photoshop, take a look at the description below. There will be a link to my Patreon channel. It's $15 a month. You get full access to all the tutorials that I'll push out to Patreon. I'll be doing live broadcasts with the Patreon community. They can ask me questions and so forth. There's only the two tiers, either $15. There's a $45 a month tier, and that's only limited to 10 people. And that group is more of a focus group where we will meet twice a month via Zoom. We'll talk about business and marketing, Photoshop, photography, work together as a small cohesive unit. If that's something you're interested in and there are seats available, then you can certainly jump into that. But again, for $15 a month, you're getting full tutorials, work files to work alongside, and so forth. I will still be bringing content to the YouTube channel. But to kind of follow the best practices of YouTube and to maximize the time here on YouTube, I'm going to be bringing you these shorter tutorials which are excerpts from the bigger ones that are out on Patreon. So again, if you want that full content and to expand your education in photography and Photoshop, consider supporting me and joining me on Patreon. Now, let's have our final thoughts. I've said many times on this channel in different tutorials that one of the best things you can do in Photoshop is to problem solve. You look at something and say, hey, I need to fix this specific thing in the image, and then you start finding the tools or the techniques in Photoshop to achieve it. But one of the consequences of that action, especially if you're trying something new, or even if you're versed with it and you've done it a bazillion times, is doubt. You as the artist, it's doubt, because you know what you're doing. You know the original image. You know what you're about to change. And this has happened to me a lot, and I'm sure it's happened to many folks who are watching this, that you start making subtle, you paint over the eyes, and then you're like, no, they don't match up, and no, this is wrong, and you doubt yourself. Go all the way through. Go all the way through the process. Even if you doubt it, go through the process. As I've said in the retouching series and other videos on the channel, you have to rest your eyes for a little bit, and that's what happened. We did the head first, then when we brought in the dress, we gave ourselves tasks to perform, things to focus on, worrying about getting rid of the fingers, making sure the dress lines up and making sure the shadows, all that stuff is good, the mask is completely painted. And through all of that, our mind focused on something else for a couple of minutes. And then when we take that full view again of the image and look at the head, our eyes have rested from the task. We've sort of forgotten a little bit of what we just saw, and we can assess the art with fresh eyes. That's the key when you try something new in Photoshop. When you try something as elaborate like this of head swaps and so forth, you've got to go all the way through. If things don't look right, it doesn't mean you just make a couple little changes and say, no, I must go all the way through. Adjust things. And if you feel stuck, the best thing to do is to share the work with friends that you trust. But here's a key factor when you do that. Reach out to some friends, show them the picture, and don't say, do you see what's wrong with this picture? Can you tell that I did something to it? Ask them, what do you think of this picture? Just give me your general thoughts. What do you like about it? What you don't like about it? You're giving them a task to perform. They're generally 99% of the time going to assess the artwork, the lighting, the colors, things to that nature. They're not going to start trying to look for where's Waldo and find the things that are wrong with it. That is a litmus test to what the general audience is going to perceive in the artwork. If you don't give people a clue that something's been changed, they're going to appreciate the art for what it is. And if they don't come back and say, well, her head looks like Beetlejuice, that's small, then you're probably good to go. I mean this with all due respect, diplomacy, kindness. Generally, in our artwork, we are our worst critic, and we are the ones standing in our way, standing in the way of the art, being everything it can be. So get out of your way. Trust yourself. Rest your eyes. Keep going forward with your own education. That's the end of this video. If you like the content, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I will be again bringing excerpts of new information and new tutorials to the YouTube channel from Patreon. If you want to support me there, I would greatly appreciate it. Again, a lot of wonderful education is planned for that community. We will have a Facebook group where we will continue the connections and discussions on all the work that we do as artists. Until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.